Oh man, Bills fans are going to hate me for this. What is going on, everybody? Welcome in to the reveal of the number 14 team in my 2024 NFL Power Rankings heading into next season. And it's the reveal of the Buffalo Bills, who certainly will be a surprise to many people. And this ranking does go against the grain a little bit. I mean, they still sit here tied for 7th in Super Bowl odds. Their over-under is as high as most teams. And they are still the favorites to win the AFC East. And that certainly doesn't align with my rankings here. We still haven't done the Dolphins or the Jets. And that does make me lower on the Bills this year. So Bills fans, you can have at me on that. But this is a team that is certainly in some bit of a transition. And I've got a lot of questions in terms of how things are going to shake down this year. We've got a lot of fun stuff to talk about. That's not to say they're doomed. They do kick off a new tier in my power rankings. We're really ramping up the conversation with the teams that are getting revealed now in the series. And now it's like teams that wouldn't just be disappointed if they missed the playoffs. It's kind of a disappointment if they don't make some noise in the playoffs. So they're still a very good football team. It's just, man, relative to the top dogs in the NFL, they have opened up a lot of question marks that we got to talk about here in this video. Before we get into it, if you could please take just a second to hit that like button, whether you agree with the ranking or not. If you enjoy the video or have enjoyed the series, it really does help. I appreciate it. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of our remaining deep dives. But let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at this team's offseason that was a very, very busy one. As we go position by position here, starting with the coaching staff, we are starting off on a good note in terms of where they got better, where they got worse this offseason. I do have the coaching staff listed as slightly upgraded. They are getting a full season of Joe Brady. They made the change at offensive coordinator last year, and if we're comparing this year's team to last year's team, they had a half year of pretty bad play calling under Ken Dorsey, so that should be an upgrade from what it was last season. Excited to see what Joe Brady can do as the full-time offensive coordinator for the Bills. At quarterback, they did bring back Mitchell Trubisky as the backup, but staying neutral in that room. At running back, I also listed this as neutral. They no longer have the veteran Latavius Murray, who did his job in that power back role, but they bring in the talented Ray Davis to be that guy in the 4th round out of Kentucky. And if he can't be that guy, I like the Frank Gore Jr. pickup, a very notable undrafted free agent pickup for them. Tight end, no change, so staying neutral. But the big one here is wide receiver. Obvious downgrades. They say goodbye to Stephon Diggs, trade him to the Houston Texans. But not just that, they let Gabe Davis walk in free agency. It's been a staple of this Bills passing game, those two guys, and opening up some very major questions with this wide receiver room, especially on the perimeter. Both those guys are excellent perimeter receiving threats. And now the majority of their talent in the receiving game, as we'll see later, are slot options. Part of that is bringing in Curtis Samuel in free agency. But the guy that they're hoping can be a presence on the perimeter for them is Keon Coleman, who they essentially spent a 1st-round pick on, trading back to the top of the 2nd round for him. Mac Hollins. They also add and Marquez Valdez-Scantling, some cheaper flyers on some perimeter receivers, but they certainly aren't what Diggs and Gabe Davis have been for them. They also, just as a minor note, lose Trent Sherfield, who played a blocking role for them, and Deontay Hardy, more of a gadget player. But needless to say, downgraded in the wide receiver room, at least until proven otherwise. And that's going to be probably the biggest area of question mark for this entire football team, is how much this new room can step up. On the offensive line, they do lose long-term starter Mitch Morse in free agency. They were already pretty equipped to replace him, as we'll see later. But they also made a nice draft pick in Cedric Van Pran in the 5th round. They also add Lyle Collins as depth. It is slightly downgraded. You are losing a starting caliber player without putting one back in. That is a move that I'm less worried about. I think they are equipped to handle it, but still have to say slightly downgraded, and it opens up some more question marks for the offense. Then you look at the defense, and they just hit the reset button on half of this roster. I mean, we haven't had a team that has this much turnover on this side of the ball. Essentially, their entire defensive line outside of Ed Oliver is going to be different this year. Guys that all played last year, Tim Settle, Jordan Phillips, Poona Ford, Linval Joseph, all gone. And they are hoping to get more games out of Daquan Jones this year, who only played a fifth of their snaps last year. They sign Austin Johnson. They draft Dwayne Carter, a pass rushing specialist out of Duke, in the third round. And they bring in some rotational depth in Deshaun Williams. I think just hopefully getting a full season of Daquan Jones, you look at this list and say that's a slight upgrade. Nothing major, but I think they can be hopeful that they'll get a little bit more on the interior this year. On the edge, this one's very much to be determined because it is entirely dependent for me on what version of Von Miller do you get at 35 years old, coming off his second ACL injury, 2 years removed now from that ACL injury. They got effectively nothing from him last season, 25% of their snaps, and he did not look good in those snaps. So can he get back to speed, or is he fried? That's going to determine what they get from this edge group, because they didn't really do much here. They do lose Leonard Floyd, who produced a lot for them last year, and Shaq Lawson. And they bring in, Dwayne Smoot, a cheap free agent, and Javon Solomon in the fifth round. If Von Miller can get back to speed, this group might be better. If he is what he was last year, this will be downgraded. So hard to say with the edge group. At linebacker, gotta say upgraded. Another player they're getting back healthy, Matt Milano. Missed the majority of last season. An easy upgrade there. They do lose Tyrell Dotson, who did play well for them last year. But they'll obviously take that swap, getting Milano back in there. And they also spent a fifth-round pick on Ulofoshio out of Washington. More changing hands at cornerback. Dane Jackson, who's eaten a lot of snaps for this team, signed with the Panthers. They also let Tre'Davious White go, who played 3 games for them last year. But they get a full season of Rasul Douglas, who they acquired at the trade deadline last year, and spent a 6th-round pick on Daquan Hardy. Essentially, I think the full season of Rasul Douglas makes up for the loss of Dane Jackson and Tre'Davious White. So going to say neutral at cornerback. At safety, got to go downgraded here. Just as they're losing the kind of staples of the vertical passing game with Diggs and Davis, they're losing the staple of this Bills defense really has been this safety duo. It's frankly hard to imagine this iteration of the Bills defense without these two guys on the back end who have been the most consistent safety duo in the league for about 5 years. Both of them gone now. And it was time. They were slowing down, but still played pretty well on the back end. And they're looking to replace them with the guys on the roster and Cole Bishop in the 2nd round out of Utah. They also bring in some veteran insurance, Mike Edwards and Kareem Jackson. They're going to be sorting through this, but how could you say anything other than downgraded with the safety room? And then no change with the specialists. So a very busy offseason, and I think you can see how, shuffling the deck a little bit in a series where we aren't giving one team too much benefit of the doubt and ranking these teams near their floor. The Bills do come into the year with a lot more pieces on the roster to prove than a lot of these other more established teams in the league. But let's transition next and talk about this coaching staff, how they rank and stack up against the rest of the league, as well as what the scheme is going to look like on both sides of the ball for the Bills. And that starts at the top with head coach Sean McDermott. And I always find it a very fascinating conversation with Sean McDermott because, look, he's a good NFL coach. If the Bills were to fire him, he would get hired and do a good job elsewhere. I think what he's done to restore the culture, make the Bills a real boy again, raise the floor of this organization, and the job he's done with this defense is impressive. But there are some things on him that I just don't think he at this point is the right head coach for the Buffalo Bills. off the bat, like, I think he's a great defensive coordinator. Call him a tier 2 defensive coordinator, but I certainly don't view Sean McDermott as one of the elite defensive minds in the league. A Spagnuolo, Flores, what Belichick has been for years, what a Mike Vrabel was able to do for his Titans defense. And even all those guys reached their ceilings as head coaches. So I don't even think he's that. But beyond that, I look at keeping Sean McDermott for the Bills as like the equivalent of signing up to have Kirk Cousins as your quarterback every year in a scenario where A, there was no salary cap, and B, there were talented, high upside young quarterbacks easily available to you every single year. I look at that as the same as what the Bills are doing with their head coach. He's fine. But how much time have we spent in this series talking about how, like, one of the biggest cheat codes you can have is to have that offensive guru for your offense? A McVay, a Shanahan, a Ben Johnson, Mike McDaniel, Matt LaFleur. And the Bills are just electing to not take a chance at that guy. And the other problem is they had that guy in Brian Daboll. But when you have the defensive guy as your head coach, the second you find that guy, he's gone. He's now the head coach for the New York Giants. So you can win with a Sean McDermott as your head coach, but just like if you have a Kirk Cousins or a Dak Prescott or a Tua as your quarterback, it's like, okay, but it has to be in a year where, you know, everybody stays healthy. The roster window is super talented before you lose guys in free agency. You got a little lucky in the playoffs, and you make it happen in 1 year. But it's much better to have that guy that gives you that year-to-year greatness. And you're just not getting year-to-year greatness with Sean McDermott. You're getting stability. You're getting a high culture. You're getting a floor for the defense. But even then, it's like January has rolled around, and the Bills' defense has been completely average to bad in most of these playoff games. So again, he's not even like an elite defensive mind. Hell, I'd rather have like Brian Flores as my head coach than Sean McDermott, because he's shown to do more with less with his defenses over the last 5 years. So to me, there's like a segment of Bills fans that'll stand by their guy and be like, you're crazy. Look at his win-loss record. He's had all this success. And say, you're nuts for putting him on the hot seat, which I am doing. I would absolutely move on from Sean McDermott if I was running the Bills. You got your 20% of Bills fans that will defend the guy, but then there is a large portion of Bills fans that are with me on this. And honestly, we just looked at this team's offseason. I don't get why they didn't make this move now. You're in a bit of a transition season. Now was the time to hit the reset button on all this, take a step back so you can take 2 steps forward in a year or two. And it's tough to call for a dude's job, but like, he would land on his feet. He would be a really nice hire for some struggling organization out there that just wants to become the 15th best team in the league. But when you have a generational quarterback and you're trying to win a Super Bowl every year, I just think the Bills are doing themselves a little bit of a disservice here. So they rank out very nicely in terms of the coaching rankings. They get B+ grades really across the board for what Sean McDermott is responsible for. Overall coach and culture, they rank 9th to 12th. For pass defense coaching, they rank, again, in that like great tier of 7th to 16th of this massive cluster of really good defensive minds in the NFL, the majority of which are defensive coordinators in the league, not head coaches. And run defense coaching, even a little bit better, 6th to 10th. He does a good job with this defense. Doesn't do an elite job with this defense. Now, in terms of what his scheme looks like, it's a 4-2 defense, a lot of zone coverage, a lot of quarters, a lot of cover 6. He, I do think, does a good job blitzing at the right moments and from the right angles with a nice creative blitz game that can be effective in a lot of matchups. But definitely what I think of most with Sean McDermott is that 4-2 front, kind of staying in nickel as much as possible and running a lot of those pattern matching zones on the back end, which is inevitably going to be a lot of quarters and cover 6. He puts a premium on communication on the back end as opposed to physical talent. It's all about understanding your coverage rules, when to trigger, when to pass off, how not to blow your gap, your assignment. communication is key in this defense, and he does a good job communicating coverage on the back end. He's had a plethora of lesser talented secondary players play above their talent level in this defense. And then you can also mention Bobby Babich, the defensive coordinator now. They had to promote him because last year Leslie Frazier had kind of left the team and Sean McDermott took over the defense. They have named Bobby Babich as the defensive coordinator. Seems like a sound hire. He's been with McDermott for a long time, and the last 4 or 5 years he's been the secondary coach, kind of when Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer were blowing up and Tre'Davious White and all those guys, Teron Johnson, all under Bobby Babich's coaching room. And then he went and coached the linebackers as well, where we've seen the Terrell Dotsons of the world, kind of everybody they've played at linebacker, Terrell Bernard, they've all played really well under him, not to mention Matt Milano playing his best football. So he seems like a really good coach. And hell, maybe even someone, if they are to make a change after this year, maybe to Joe Brady as a head coach would be something to keep an eye out for if I was in charge here. But maybe someone that can replace Sean McDermott, but keep the same structure of this defense that has worked pretty well for them in place. I don't know, just something to keep an eye out for. He's been around for a while, and now getting a defensive coordinator opportunity. So good for Bobby. But yeah, Joe Brady is the offensive coordinator here, and to me, he's the asset of this coaching staff. You go back about 4 years ago, Joe Brady was like one of the hot minds in terms of those young ascending offensive coordinators that should be head coaches within a few years. He was Joe Burrow's offensive coordinator at LSU, the most prolific college passing game I've ever seen. Granted, he had, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Joe Burrow. That tends to help, but some of the stuff they were doing to even elevate those guys and help get them open was really working. And he gets the Panthers job after that. And look, everybody has failed in Carolina. Whether that's Baker or Darnold or Frank Reich, Joe Brady. Not to say he didn't have his warts when he was calling plays for Carolina, but it just has been a very tough environment for guys to succeed in the NFL. So his shot at calling plays in the NFL with Teddy Bridgewater, Sam Darnold, the broken shell of Cam Newton on the ass end of his career, it didn't work, right? And he ended up plummeting down the coaching ranking lists. Buffalo hires him as the quarterback's coach, and then last year when Ken Dorsey was really struggling with this offense, they say, okay, Joe, you give it a try. And things got better overnight. It was one of the most impressive, week A to week B. The only thing changing was the offensive coordinator, and everything improved. Much more creative in the run game, simplifying the passing game. I think Joe Brady absolutely landed back on his feet here in Buffalo. And I think the Bills fans are lucky to have him. A guy that, again, just 2 or 3 years ago was looked at as one of those dudes. Just had, a couple years in Carolina set him back. So really, to me, it's like if he can continue what he did last year, this Bills offense is going to be a force for this team. If he is out here with a motley crew of wide receivers and a rookie Keon Coleman, and they're still a 10-win team, one of the top offenses in the league, I would actually be pretty surprised if Joe Brady isn't at least getting head coach interviews after that. And at that point, I'm like, Buffalo, hello, you just did this with Brian Dable. You really want to go back to risking getting another Ken Dorsey in here? Hello, Buffalo. Let's be the first team here that wakes up and says, all right, sorry, defensive head coach, you've done great stuff for us here, but Joe Brady needs to be our guy for the future. It's something I would be heavily considering. I know there's a human aspect to this, and that's never been done. I mean, in an ideal world, you could just say, Sean, can you just step down? Can you just be our defensive coordinator? We love you. We want you in this building. You can be the defensive head coach for all we care. But we got to get a stable, elite offensive mind to keep with Josh Allen, get that continuity on that side of the ball too. Again, I just think it's a very fascinating conversation. He still has to prove it. To this point, the majority of his offenses have not worked in the NFL. Granted, again, that was in Carolina. Really encouraged by what we saw at the end of last season, though, and I definitely think the arrow is pointing up on him to exceed my rankings of him, which are 15th to 19th for pass game coaching, still like really good. Run game coaching a little bit lower, 18th to 21st, but I think those are respectable ranks for someone that still has a lot to prove, really. As far as what Joe Brady's scheme is going to look like, it's very much that kind of modern pro spread type of offense. You're going to get a lot of shotgun here in Buffalo, 2x2, 3x1 formations, really leaning into the threat of Josh Allen's legs in the run game. Maybe not, force feeding him 8 touches a game, but still making it look like you were maybe going to give him the ball to keep backside ends honest and just keep that threat of Josh Allen running always in the defense's mind, and something they have to count for with the numbers as well. And we saw the run game really explode when Joe Brady took over with that kind of similar concept that we just talked about with the Colts and Shane Steichen and Anthony Richardson, where it's like, all right, instead of lining up in 12 personnel and trying to smash guys all game, let's spread them out. Let's get a numbers advantage here and simplify the run game in a logical way that works. They also use the threat of, the bubble screens and RPOs to the perimeter to be an addition to the early down offense, the pass game married with the run game, all that kind of stuff. And I think he's very sound in terms of his design of the drop back passing game as well. So a positive review of Joe Brady, but a mixed review on this coaching staff as a whole. I think it's a very good NFL coaching staff, obviously. But is it the best coaching staff that the Bills could have to get them where they want to go? I would raise the question and argue no. But at the end of the day, it's, players got to make the plays. So let's transition to talk about this kind of new look Buffalo Bills roster and if they have what it takes to really shatter my 14th overall ranking of the Bills here this year. And we'll start at quarterback. I mean, if we've got questions on this roster, it does not relate to Josh Allen. He has firmly planted himself as the best quarterback in the NFL, not named Patrick Mahomes, in my opinion. Yes, I know Lamar won the MVP last year, but if you're going to sit here and ask which quarterback really was the most valuable to their team in the regular season, if you replaced the quarterback with Joe Schmo, Derek Carr, what's the difference in wins? I would argue Josh Allen was the real MVP last year and might have to do that again this year. And that's going to ruffle some feathers out there because you turn on ESPN, talk show, morning radio, whatever, and all they want to do is highlight the interceptions and say how stupid this guy is. And I've been guilty of that at times as well, but that narrative has just become way overblown. I think it's relevant if you're trying to compare him to Patrick Mahomes. It's a relevant point used against him. But then people remember that and then use that when you're comparing him to Lamar Jackson and Joe Burrow and all these other great quarterbacks who also make stupid reads and turn the ball over and do stupid stuff at times as well. And in the case of Lamar Jackson, it's usually in January that he's doing those things as opposed to Josh Allen, where it's a week 1 game against the Jets. You get what I'm saying? You look back at the whole picture, and number one, the interceptions are overstated. His turnover-worthy play percentage last year was 20th in the league, so that's league average. He was just a tiny tick above Jordan Love, CJ Stroud, Lamar Jackson, lower than Brock Purdy, lower than Tua, lower than Trevor Lawrence. So it's not elite in terms of protecting the football, but when you look at the grand scheme of things, it's not a severe weakness in his game. I think it's also notable that he had one of the highest rates of turnover-worthy plays that resulted in actual turnovers. So teams were capitalizing on his mistakes much more than some of the other games' top quarterbacks. And that's where you get him to be second in the NFL in interceptions. But you also have to remember he was fourth in the NFL in pass attempts. So he opened up the opportunity to throw more interceptions. Mahomes himself threw 15 to Josh Allen's 18. So I'm not saying he doesn't make stupid reads and, put his team in tough spots occasionally, but I think that narrative has become overblown. And really, outside of the Jets game, he's not really making those mistakes in high leverage situations. Unlike a Lamar Jackson that's just chucking it up to triple coverage in the fourth quarter of the AFC Championship for no reason at all. Or even my guy Jordan Love, like really bad interception thrown across his body at the end of the game. How often in a big game, other than that Jets game that was week 1 last year, how often is Josh Allen losing the game for his team? I would argue 10 times to 1, he's very clutch in the fourth quarter, making big drives, keeping his team alive. And when playoffs have rolled around, he's been as good as any quarterback not named Patrick Mahomes. And at the end of the day, I don't even think this is like a controversial argument in the lens of most NFL fans. But I think it does do a good job to paint the picture of like, all right, this is special. This is a generational quarterback currently putting, in my opinion, a very average football team on his back, putting them in the playoffs and winning playoff games for them. And you talk about, the turnovers hurt them. That is also just a part of who he is. If he didn't play aggressive, he wouldn't be able to make the ridiculous plays that he does with his arm and his legs, where I've been on the record for like 4 years now saying this is the most physically talented quarterback that has ever played football. And I'll stand by that. I think he's actually a better athlete than Cam Newton was. He has a better overall arm and more size than Michael Vick, Lamar Jackson. He's just a more of an overall specimen than guys like Mahomes and Aaron Rodgers. We'll see what like Anthony Richardson can be in time, but he knows he has these tools, and it leads to some of the most batshit crazy, insane plays that you'll see throughout the course of a season. And you can bag on him for the turnover-worthy plays, but that also allows him to lead the NFL in big-time throws, as he did last season, and was second in the NFL in big-time throw percentage. And I would argue the turnovers that he does have are well made up for by 3-1 in terms of making big plays, winning games for his team. I mean, Jesus, I would have hated to see what the Buffalo Bills would have been last year without Josh Allen. So it's kind of nice that we get to set this up and be like, all right, you got Josh. You're always going to be in the mix when you have Josh. But really, what does the rest of this team look like? And I'm going to just gloss over Mitch Trubisky as we get to that conversation because I just don't want to talk about Mitch Trubisky. And let's transition to the weapons who Josh Allen is going to be throwing the ball to here. And right off the bat here, we're ranking pretty low for weaponry for the Bills. I have them with a C+ grade, which gets them 25th to 27th in the NFL. Not exactly ideal. Now, there's some good players here, but it's a strangely constructed group. How often do we talk about in this series about having a complementary group of weapons? Having a group that together makes sense. Everybody's going to kind of have their role, their route tree within the offense. With here, it's like, I don't really get how this is going to work. It's like 4 slot receivers, essentially, when you factor in the 2 tight ends, maybe even 5 if you argue James Cook as a part of that short to intermediate passing game, and then a slow, big-bodied rookie wide receiver in Keon Coleman. And then, yeah, technically you've got Marquez Valdes-Scantling as like the designated deep threat if he makes this team. But even if you look at it on paper, or if you're just loading up the Madden roster or whatever, you're like, all right, they got a 77, they got a 77, a 79, Josh Allen's elite. Like, they can make this work. But I raised the additional question of, like, did they do a good job of, like, picking from the right picking the right apples from the tree and putting them back in the right spot in terms of skill sets? It's going to be interesting to see what their kind of vision is here. When you're taking the most explosive quarterback in the league and saying, well, here's a bunch of slot guys, go make it work. It's weird. But let's go through the group. You got Khalil Shakir, slot wide receiver. Reminds me a ton of Golden Tate in his prime. And I actually think Khalil Shakir is going to kill it. Like, you talk about your fantasy drafts, or if you're playing on Underdog with promo code TFG, this is the dude in this offense I want. Super impressed by his film last year. Way more explosive than I remember watching him at Boise State, especially after the catch. He's not a vertical threat. We've hit on that. But in terms of quick targets, run after catch opportunities, running two-way goes from the slots, crossing routes where I think he does have enough speed to pull away from linebackers and slot corners and safeties, winning some tough catches over the middle of the field. Wouldn't be the least bit surprised if Khalil Shakir emerges as a legit piece here. One of the premium slot wide receivers in the league, frankly. Like, I'm not going to go quite as far as saying he could be a Amon-Ra St. Brown, but the skill set is similar. And if he settles in as, one of the best slot receivers in the NFL, not named Amon-Ra St. Brown, I think that's in his range of outcomes. But that is as a slot wide receiver. Enter Curtis Samuel, who they paid a decent chunk of change in free agency. And I wouldn't be surprised if they think he can be more of a vertical threat for them. But you look at what he's done in Washington, and he's frankly struggled going all the way back to his time in Carolina. He just doesn't have the skill set to be a deep threat, or at least hasn't shown it so far. He doesn't track the ball well. When he gets those deep targets, he's got a ton of drops. He does not have the contested catch ability to win tough balls. He doesn't have a big catch radius. You have to be right on the money. This isn't Gabe Davis, where you can throw it a little bit out in front of him and he can go make a big catch like that. He's not Keon Coleman in that way. It would be a bit of a stretch to say, all right, he's going to step outside and be really good. But the thing is, he's going to play a lot outside because you've got Shakir, and then you're going to have Dalton Kincaid. Like, if you go 2x2, you're going to have Dalton Kincaid as the other slot wide receiver. So he's going to play outside a lot. And, I give him a good ranking as a wide receiver here with a 77 grade. He's a very useful manufactured touch, quasi running back, like gadget player. That's what he's been in Washington. But there's a reason they drafted Jahan Dotson to be the number 2 wide receiver to get more of those outside snaps. And if you're projecting him with a role in this offense, if Khalil Shakir is the guy I think he is, I don't think he can even play up to that 77 grade as an outside wide receiver. It's a weird fit. I know some people are really optimistic about what he's going to do. I just think Shakir is the better complete player, even if he's not the athlete that Curtis Samuel is. And ultimately, I think he's going to make it pretty tough for a guy like Curtis Samuel to succeed here. And I would honestly predict, as the year goes on, it's a lot more Keon Coleman out there, maybe even Mac Hollins as an outside wide receiver. Because as the year goes on, they're going to be like, well, we don't really need Samuel. We've got Shakir, we've got Dalton Kincaid, and Curtis Samuel could turn into kind of what Deontay Hardy was for them last year, where he's just a gadget guy. I'm just not very high on this signing and don't really understand how he fully fits into the picture here. And then you got Keon Coleman, who does make sense from a skill set perspective in terms of what they're missing here. Kind of. Coleman was an interesting prospect in that he's just not fast, right? He is a big-bodied ball winner. And for that reason, the lack of speed, I did think a lot of good snaps from Keon Coleman were going to come from him as a big slot in a bit of like a Michael Thomas, Drake London, Michael Pittman kind of way, where he's not just a slot wide receiver, but you can get a lot of good reps from him in that way. And my God, there's just no opportunity to put him in the slot. You've got 4 other dudes that are going to be getting into the slot. So he's going to be stuck on the outside where his ability to separate is just a legitimate question. And he's not really a true vertical threat, even like a Gabe Davis who had some long speed. Keon Coleman is more of a slants, back shoulders, digs, hitches, more of an intermediate to short guy in terms of route depth. So again, you're like kind of still missing that vertical threat, but in those routes we described, I do think he fits well as that sort of X. And when Josh Allen gets in a pinch, he's going to be a nice guy to just, work with in scramble drill, have him just go make a big catch and keep the drive alive. Like, I did like the Keon Coleman pick in a vacuum. I think he does make sense as one of 3 players here. I just wish they had more of a complete wide receiver that could threaten to all 3 levels to be more of a complement to Keon Coleman and Khalil Shakir, kind of like a Stephon Diggs. But in terms of production, I do think Keon Coleman has a good year. There's just too much opportunity for him to not capitalize on it. I think he's going to prove to be a good pick. And a very common pro comp on him was Michael Pittman, who went at the top of the 2nd round. Like, can he eventually become a Michael Pittman type of wide receiver for this team? Yeah, I think so. But even Pittman has had his shortcomings in terms of becoming that, 1A type of weapon. And Coleman just, he's coming in as a rookie. He's got a lot to prove. But then you have to bring Dalton Kincaid into the conversation here, who is much more of a slot wide receiver for this team than he is a tight end. At least, especially as long as Dawson Knox is here, because Knox is the better blocker and the bigger player. So as long as Knox is here, he's essentially their starting tight end, but it does get very murky because they will have Kincaid put his hand in the dirt, try to be a mismatch problem, really get him on linebackers. Depending on what type of run they want to go with as well, like, he can have practicality. They can use him as a split zone blocker where he's coming across formation and all he has to do is like get his hand on a defensive end. Like, there's certain runs where they can neutralize Dalton Kincaid as a blocker enough that they will still use him as a tight end. But the majority of his snaps are going to come either probably in a 2x2 formation where he's the slot wide receiver opposite of Khalil Shakir, in a 3x1 or in a 3x1 formation where he's either flexed as isolated as the single wide receiver or also in the slot with a guy like Khalil Shakir. And from a slot wide receiver position, I mean, he is an absolute handful. He was a hit in his rookie season. They kind of struggled especially with the offensive coordinator change. Like, it definitely took them some time to really figure out, like, okay, how do we want to use this guy? But in the second half of the year, I mean, he was getting 6 or so targets a week and really starting to produce for this offense. I anticipate a similar role this year, and if he ends up, I do think Khalil Shakir ultimately leads the team in receiving yards, but I think he's certainly the favorite to be second in overall receiving yards and to have a pretty nice year here for the Bills. Runs really nice routes, strong hands, tough after the catch. Maybe the best trait he has is his IQ to kind of pace his routes, sit down in zones, be quarterback friendly in a lot of the ways that, like, the Chiefs use Travis Kelce, where it's like you're more running to a space in the zone. You don't have like a specific route that you're running. It's just get to this space within this amount of time and present yourself for Josh Allen. He has the IQ to be that guy, and that's only going to grow in time, especially as they're looking for playmakers in this offense. So there's plenty of reason to be excited for Dalton Kincaid. He had a good rookie tight end season, and that arrow is definitely pointing up. I mean, the pro comp on him was Zach Ertz. Zach Ertz in his prime was a top 3 tight end in the NFL. I think Kincaid could get there as early as this year. He has the highest upside overall weapon that they have right now. And that kind of rounds out their primary targets. Dawson Knox, there's just not a ton to say about him. He became very replaceable within this offense the second they drafted Kincaid, because he has speed and can make some tough catches. He's kind of like a low-end starting tight end. They thought he was maybe going to take a step up when they paid him, and he hasn't really done that. He still had drop issues and is just kind of iffy in terms of ball skills. He's not a dominant blocker. He's all right. As a tight end too, they do use him. They like to get into 12 personnel to help out the run game. It's, he's got his role within this offense, but in terms of elevating the weapons here, there's just not a ton to really say there. But there is one more important piece here, and that is James Cook. Reminds me a lot of what we said about Travis Etienne as a receiving threat, where there's no denying when things are clicking. He's one of the most dynamic, high-end, explosive receiving backs in the league. But he's had drops. And in the case of James Cook, he's had a lot of drops. I mean, he left a lot of production, a lot of drives on the board for the Bills last year. And from a pass protection standpoint, he's an issue. You're basically wasting your time asking him to pass protect right now. So he gets a B grade from me as a receiving back, but it's like, well, yeah, but in terms of route running, when he catches the ball, how good he is after the catch, he's like an A. But it's got to be the complete picture as well in terms of putting it all together. Those things can be coached up and developed, but he's got to go out and prove it if I'm going to look at James Cook and be like, he's an elite receiving back. Still a weapon, though, and will make teams pay from time to time if they leave him open underneath, and is dynamic in the screen game as well. But, of course, it's a running back, not exactly contributing to what we've talked about where it's like, where's the overall explosiveness with this team? Your four best, highest upside options here are going to hurt you underneath, hurt you in the intermediate. But when big game Sugar High Josh shows up and he wants to unleash that 50-yard post that's a back-breaking play to the defense, where's that going to? Curtis Samuel? Marquez Valdes-Scantling? Like, it just takes the ceiling quite literally off of this group of weapons as a whole. But let's talk about the depth here. So you have Mac Hollins. Talked about him a little bit. Would not be surprised if you look back at by the end of the season and he actually outsnaps Curtis Samuel, just because I think there's more of a fit for his role within this offense. But if Keon Coleman's balling out, they might not feel the need to put Mac Hollins out there. But you go back a year when he was on the Raiders and didn't have Desmond Ridder as his quarterback, he was a capable, starting caliber wide receiver. So if he can get back to kind of 2022 form, I think it was a nice little signing. Wouldn't be surprised if he has some good games in there. From a skill set perspective, he's not too far off of Gabe Davis. You got Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who we've probably referenced about 10 times in this video. He's definitely going to go down as guys sitting in a room drinking beer talking about players that they remember from 20 years ago. MVS is totally going to be one of those dudes because he's just very memorable. Definition of a one-trick pony, go far, go fast, and then has some of the most laughable drop issues I think I've ever seen. And oftentimes, teams just don't even take him serious because it's like you want that deep threat that forces teams to play in too high and defend you a certain way. But a lot of times teams will just be like, oh, MVS is out here. Should we check into quarters? Should we check into, cover two or whatever? And then they're like, nah, we're all right. If he catches it, we'll let MVS beat us. Now, when playoffs have rolled around, MVS has showed up and been a big part of the Chiefs' game plan. But, man, week to week, you just have literally no idea if he's going to catch the ball. And there's talk about whether or not he's actually going to make this team. I think he should definitely make this team just because if you need to drop a designated, deep shot, I don't know who the hell else you're doing. I don't know who the hell else you're doing that for. Is it Chase Claypool? I mean, talk about frustrating inconsistencies. Would be fun. I mean, he was a very promising player for the Steelers, but seems like a bit of a head case off the field. You got Andy Isabella's on this team, was a second-round pick with a lot of theoretical speed, but never played as fast as his 40 time indicated. Justin Shorter, just a poor man's Mac Hollins, who they spent a late-round pick on last year, I think. KJ Hamler is a Curtis Samuel-esque, talented player with the ball in his hands who's had a hard time staying healthy. They have interesting names on this depth chart, but if you're being honest with yourself, there's just nobody you should be too excited with here on this depth chart. Not much left to say in terms of tight ends and running backs. We already broke down two tight ends. They got Quentin Morris has made some catches for the Bills. Zach Davidson has a ton of athleticism, if anything clicked for him. In terms of running backs, Ray Davis was brought in here probably for a little bit of pass protection, but also to just be more of a bruiser in the run game. Not much in terms of receiving chops. Ty Johnson's a good athlete. Darrington Evans is a good athlete, but James Cook has that role. And that kind of concludes your depth overview. But yeah, it's like a high floor group. They're going to be able to annoy you in the short to intermediate game. And maybe their overall philosophy here is like, you know what, let's rein Josh in and just not even give him the option to throw the ball deep and chuck the ball into double coverage once a month. But to me, that's just not what you should be doing with Josh Allen. I think you should embrace his upside more than what they're doing with this group of weapons. And I think it's going to be a bit of a transition season where some of these guys play well, but I think they're going to go into next offseason and ultimately need a little bit more juice on the outside than what they're getting right now. Then you got the running back room as runners, and that starts with James Cook. He actually impressed me last year, and I think especially when we talk about what this run game looks like, where they want to spread you out, and then Josh Allen is their power back a lot of the times, right? You look at James Cook, and in a vacuum, he has his deficiencies. He doesn't have a lick of power in terms of yards after contact, and most of his yards after contact come from, okay, he broke an arm tackle and then got 25 yards. It's like, okay, well, that's going to inflate your overall yards after contact, disproportionate to a lot of other guys where it's like, okay, they're churning out 3 or 4 yards at like legit after contact every snap, like a James Conner, for example. James Cook doesn't have real power as a runner. He's 195 pounds. And then the fumbles, like, dude has got to do a better job protecting the football. So he has his shortcomings as a runner. But like I was saying, you put him in the context of this offense where you're spreading things out, you're not leaning on the power as much, you're opening up big lanes and big rush opportunities for a guy like him with his speed. And then when you really do just need 3rd and 1, okay, he's either coming off the field for a guy like Ray Davis, who we'll talk about, or just let Josh do it, Whether it's a QB sneak or QB power or speed option, whatever the hell they want to do, Josh Allen is their starting power back here. And that allows you to have a James Cook. Now, he doesn't have true power, but the last thing I want to say on James Cook in an area that he's impressed me is my perspective on these light running backs has changed in recent years. We've seen a lot of guys like James Cook have a lot of success in the NFL because force equals mass times acceleration. And even if you don't have the mass, some of these smaller backs like an Achane or what Keaton Mitchell was doing for Baltimore last year was insane before he got hurt. Gibbs in Detroit. Even if you're not the biggest guy, if you have that explosive speed and acceleration, you have enough force, enough power to at least run through arm tackles and have contact balance in that way and actually break tackles in a way that I typically don't give these running backs credit. So, Cook is a really dynamic, explosive rushing threat for this team, even if he has his deficiencies in terms of completeness as a runner, the fumbling, and even his vision can be hit or miss at times. But I do find myself liking James Cook, and I put the up arrow on him because honestly, like we do, color-coded tiers for these guys in this series, I'd have him in the stud tier if not for the fumbles. But if we're going to criticize quarterbacks for interceptions and making stupid mistakes, if you're one of the most fumble-prone running backs in the league, I think you have to be dinged for that. Those are oftentimes back-breaking plays against your team. And his overall ball skills are just not good. He's got the drops. He fumbles the ball in the receiving game, and he fumbled the ball 4 times as a runner last year too. So clean that up, and I honestly would look at James Cook as more of a top 10 running back in the league or so. He's really impressed me. He's been much better as a runner than I ever thought he would be. So I was wrong about him as a prospect, but there's still a lot of stuff to clean up. And then Ray Davis did make sense, a 4th-round pick. My take on him coming out was drafting Ray Davis is like eating your vegetables. You're never going to be excited about him. You're probably never going to look at him as a potential starter or anything like that, but tough, size, can be what they had in Latavius Murray last year, on the cheap, on a rookie contract. Good, solid player. Just never expect too much from him. Not going to bring the dynamism of a James Cook. Probably not going to do much in the receiving game, but I think he's going to play a nice role here. Something like what Alexander Madison was for James's brother, Dalvin, in Minnesota for a long time. Then down the depth, you got Ty Johnson. Good backup for James Cook. He's got a lot of juice, but similar limitations to a James Cook. So if Cook goes down, you've got a nice kind of seamless replacement there. Darrington Evans, same style of back. So they've got that archetype on this roster. And then Frank Gore Jr. is back to the Ray Davis style. He doesn't have the size of a Ray Davis, and Frank Gore was severely under-talented in terms of size and speed and all that. And it's not like his dad was always the best athlete in the world. He was always more of a tough runner, smart runner. But he definitely didn't even get his dad's traits. But he did get his dad's work ethic, toughness, and vision on the football field. Reminds me a ton of Devin Singletary, who the Bills are obviously very familiar with. So I like adding him. Might hang around on the practice squad until injury opportunities pop up for him, but definitely worth talking about who he was as a prospect. Fun pickup. And then, of course, the QB run multiplier for the Bills is a huge part of all of this. I mean, we probably didn't even talk enough about it when we were praising Josh Allen as the second best quarterback in the league. If we look back at that QB graphic for a second, he was third in passing. There is actually one other quarterback that I rank out higher as just a overall passing game quarterback, but he's quite clearly the second best overall quarterback because of this QB run multiplier. And I think you can probably guess who that other quarterback is there, but I'll leave that up for interpretation for now. But I talked about Josh Allen was probably the closest thing to the real MVP last year. And it's because this run game, I don't think would be much without him. I think he is integral to the style of run game they want to run with a lot of shotgun runs, but also allowing them to have a guy like James Cook as their primary running back. That's only because Josh Allen, not just how he opens things up in the run game, but because Josh Allen is your actual power running threat most of the time. And honestly, I think the multiplying effect he has on this run game is so obvious, yet he doesn't seem to get credit for it in the way that a guy like Lamar Jackson does. And I get it. They don't give him quite as many designed runs as someone like Lamar, so the pure volume isn't there. But I think the overall impact in terms of this running game is significantly better than it ever should be because of the quarterback. It's very close. And it's really what sets this over the edge in terms of he is literally putting this team on his back. So he's sensational in that regard as well. He gets the second highest QB run multiplier grade in the NFL from me. And in terms of the overall running back grade, I forgot to mention that. They came in 20th for me. Arrow pointing up, they could exceed that. Overall, I walked away impressed by James Cook, and I didn't ever really, see myself considering the Bills having a top 20 running back room when it's primarily James Cook. I like him. It's just clean up the damn fumbles, dude. Really explosive option for this offense. Might be their biggest big play threat in the entire offense. But let's talk about the offensive line. It's an okay unit. They came out as my 23rd to 24th overall offensive line with a C grade. A little bit better in pass protection, 18th to 22nd, C plus grade. Run blocking, though, 23rd to 25th with a C grade. They're fine and have a little bit of upside to be better than this, but I think they're hoping for kind of a league average offensive line. That's been kind of what they've aimed for here in the Josh Allen era, and ultimately, I think they'll probably get those results, but that's not to say there aren't some questions here. Those questions don't come at left tackle. Deion Dawkins is a true stud. There was a little bit of a scare that they were maybe going to transition away from him as their left tackle. Thank God they didn't. He ends up getting a 3-year, $60 million contract, paid kind of that franchise left tackle money. Well worth it. He's not the best left tackle in the league, but he is certainly of that caliber. Top 15. I mean, there's a lot of really good left tackles in the league, but he's reliable, really consistent pass protector. He's an okay athlete and a pretty good run blocker because his play strength is pretty good and he's a smart dude, but certainly not the first guy that comes to mind in terms of these incredible athletes at left tackle. But getting him back was definitely critical here, especially as we look down the board. I mean, we can just fast forward to talk about the tackle depth. I mean, Tommy Doyle and Ryan Van Demark are your backup tackles, and they added Lyle Collins, who's hasn't really played in over a year and hasn't played well in over 2 years, and they're listing him as a guard, good run blocker, but his pass protection's been a nightmare. Just a complete wild card kind of backup flyer. If that's what they were counting on, and granted they could have gone out and made a different signing, but things could look a lot worse here without Deion Dawkins. I'll say that. But then you probably have your biggest question mark at left guard in David Edwards. Not my lowest rated offensive lineman in this group. That's Osiris Torrance, but you feel pretty good about the arrow pointing up on him in year 2. David Edwards, I mean, talk about wild card signings, really, as we did with Lyle Collins. We don't know what David Edwards is at this point. The last time he was a full-time starter was 2021 on that Rams Super Bowl team. Played every snap for them and was a pretty good guard. Looked like he was kind of an ascending, younger offensive lineman, a 5th-round pick out of Wisconsin that was looking like a big hit for the Rams. But then he goes down early in the 2022 season for the Rams that was just detonated by injuries. He was a part of that and just became an afterthought. Got no money. The Rams let him go, even though he ended up signing very cheap in Buffalo. He hangs around as a backup last year, and they looked at him this offseason and gave him a 2-year, $6 million contract, which is like basically what like the best backup guards get in the league. But they gave him 2 years because they're like, well, if you're a hit, you could be a huge luxury for us. Interesting player. Really hasn't shown too much bad football in the last 2 years, but he's also shown us no football in the last 2 years. So he gets that unique yellow up and down arrow key for us, where I give him a 72 grade as a very balanced overall, like starting caliber guard. The last time he was a full starter, he was like a good starter. But that Rams play action heavy system has been known to make guys look better. They clearly didn't put a premium on getting him back, and he could play at a pretty low level and actually be a bit of a problem for this Bills team. He's a tough player to know exactly what they're getting from. Now, they do have some flexibility. If he really sucks, they do have Lyle Collins. We'll just double tap him, and then we'll be good on the Lyle Collins conversation. He also gets that yellow arrow. One of the faster fall-offs you'll ever see, from like top 5 right tackle to nobody wants this guy overnight. The Cowboys cut him. He got like not a lot of money from the Bengals. Everybody said it was a really good signing. And then he was a complete liability for the Bengals, who also just hasn't been able to stay healthy. I think we can pretty safely say he's not a good tackle at this point, but they did sign him as a guard, where he has played some in his career, and he's still been a really good run blocker when he's played. So if his pass blocking could be a little bit better at guard, you actually may have just signed like a really good guard for nothing here. Or you just signed a guy that can't stay healthy, is checked out, and sucks now. But he's an interesting flyer at guard if David Edwards really sucks. And then you have a little bit more flexibility as we transition to Connor McGovern, who is going from their left guard last year to now replacing Mitch Morse at center. Another former Cowboy here, a 3rd-round pick out of Penn State, and has just proven, in my opinion, that he's just a really good pass protector, not the best athlete, not the best run blocker. He's played some center. It's mostly a new position, at least in terms of being a starter. He's mostly been a guard. But every reason to believe that he can essentially give you what Mitch Morse gave you last year, if not a little bit more in terms of pass blocking consistency. I think they feel pretty damn good about him being a good center. And honestly, the contract they gave him last offseason is looking like one of the best budget deals in the entire league right now. I mean, he got 3 years, $23 million. There are guards of somewhat similar caliber that got close to $23 million for 1 year. The guard market just exploded this offseason. So they have him on a very team-friendly contract. And if you're really struggling at guard, which I do think is possible, like I said, they have the flexibility to say, all right, McGovern, you kick back to left guard where we know you can play. You did it last year. And let's go to Cedric Van Pran. I know we're kind of getting a roundabout conversation as we work through this offensive line, but I think it makes sense to do it this way because I think Cedric Van Pran was an absolute steal in the 5th round. I had an identical grade on Van Pran as I did on Zach Frazier out of West Virginia, who went in the 2nd round. Sounds like he's struggling to win that starting job in Pittsburgh. But I thought his tape was better. Everybody liked Frazier better, but I felt like Van Pran was a much better athlete, a stickier blocker, frankly, would have been a better fit in Pittsburgh for a wide zone blocking scheme. I think he's one of these dudes that if you want to pull your center on QB power, get him on the move on screens, maybe not the most powerful overall center in terms of play strength and pass blocking anchor and all that stuff, but just a really smart, scrappy, quick center. Not horribly undersized, but not ideal measurables. I think he's good, man. And this team has hit on mid-round offensive linemen for a long time. They've typically been more like second, third round guys that they've hit on, but they do have a good eye for these guys outside the first round, and would not be the least bit surprised if the season ends and McGovern's back at guard and Van Pran is starting at center and looking like a total steal in the 5th round. So I like that insurance, but obviously very unproven as a 5th round center. And then you're also unproven at right guard. Osiris Torrance was just okay in his rookie season. Not quite as good as I thought he would be. I mean, I really liked his floor coming out, and he took a few more losses than I frankly expected for a rookie. But, I mean, he's an absolute mauler in terms of play strength, and there are reps in the run game where he can really move guys. I think the speed of the game just hurt his consistency, both in the run game where you did see him kind of whiff on blocks, not fully understanding his assignment where he can play fast. And then in pass protection too, if he was losing, it was either his feet were too slow or he was struggling to like pick up and recognize stunts. Like the Steelers had the time of their life just playing games with Osiris Torrance, and he really struggled in that last game of the year. Definitely some stuff to clean up there, but I think he's still a good player overall for a second-round rookie guard. He gave you about what you expect there. I don't think he exceeded expectations, but I definitely think you saw enough where you're confident that the growth can come in year 2. But if he doesn't develop, he's going to be just kind of a replacement level, okay, kind of weak link for the offensive line. But one reason to be optimistic that that growth will come is the growth we saw from Spencer Brown last year, where this guy was a hyper athlete out of Northern Iowa, a 3rd-round pick that for the first 2 years of his career looked like a flop. Like he could not block anybody out there. He had been benched and really was not looking like a hit. And heading into last year, I highlighted him as like the biggest question mark for this team. And they had a bunch of other stuff go to shit, but not Spencer Brown. I mean, they stood by him because of his traits, hyper athlete, hyper length. And I mean, the sky's the limit now. Year 3, everything clicked. He wasn't a superstar, still had his moments where the technique was a little off, or he was slow to react to an inside counter, or, got beat by the bull rush, caught flat-footed a little bit. Like, not going to sit here and say he's an elite player now, but he's definitely a good right tackle. And the growth trajectory now becomes an excitement point for this offense. You could make a strong argument he is the highest upside player on this team, not named Josh Allen, just because of the tools and the growth trajectory. You have every reason to be excited about what you saw from him because things really got cleaned up last year. And in the run game, things finally clicked there. He wasn't dipping his head and blowing assignments as much. And when he connects, it's a thing of beauty. So I look at him as something like a young Brian O'Neill that took a little bit of time, but after things kind of connected, it really could head towards becoming one of the best right tackles in the NFL. And I think that pretty much covers it. The only guy we haven't really talked about would be Tylen Grable, who they spent a 6th-round pick on, developmental tackle that you're not expecting anything from this year. And then they did also add some center depth in a guy in Will Clapp that has played a lot of games. If Van Pran really sucks, and David Edwards sucks, and Lyle Collins sucks, you could have that scenario where your best 5 might have to be Will Clapp with McGovern back at guard. That's a worst-case scenario, but it's not a bad, plan D for this offensive line. Ultimately, I think this can be sort of a league average-ish offensive line, one of those groups that maybe doesn't help them do what they want to do, but can be a well-rounded enough group that allows them to do what they want to do. Allows essentially Josh Allen to carry the offense as we transition to the offensive summary. I mean, when you look at it from this lens, like the whole Josh Allen MVP narrative makes a lot more sense. this is a bottom 10 offensive roster that is still a top 10 offense because of the quarterback. They rank 9th in passing game, where again, I have the 3rd overall passing grade on Josh Allen at quarterback, and then below average everywhere else. And then the run game, same deal. They're my 14th ranked run game. Everything is below average except for the quarterback that elevates this group. And I'm just saying this right now, heading into the year, like, unless these receivers end up way better than we think, and you get some surprise output there, like Keon Coleman's a rookie of the year, or they located the next, Deshaun Jackson and Curtis Samuel, or, Dalton Kincaid catches 150 passes for 2,000 yards and is, an elite tight end. And I think the offensive line kind of is what they are. Unless it turns out Josh Allen is getting more help than the picture we're painting right now, if they make the playoffs, win 10 games, and this is a top 5 offense, give the damn dude the MVP. There is no quarterback truly putting the team on his back to the volume that is happening in Buffalo right now. And that goes hand in hand with the defense we're about to talk about here. It's just not a very talented defense. There's a ton of turnover and a lot of question marks here. And that starts at the defensive line. Yet another average group for me. They come in with a C plus grade for overall defensive line, 21st to 24th. C plus for pass rush, 18th to 24th. C plus for run defense, 16th to 23rd. They're fine, but nobody's afraid of the Bills' defensive line. They're just not. Ed Oliver's your best player. I like Ed Oliver, but he needs some help. He is very week to week. I do like, he's very productive. He had 72 pressures, double-digit sacks. You look back on his season, and he's a number 2. He's a very productive interior defensive lineman. I like him a lot, but there are games where he disappears. I do think he's a matchup-dependent player because he's such a unique interior player. He's 280 pounds. He doesn't have a lot of play strength. From a run defense perspective, he's mostly bad, though sometimes his quickness and strong arms can, lead to some good run stops. He's not entirely useless there, but he needs to be a 3-tech and a complement to a bigger bodied defensive tackle. And I just think there are certain matchups where the right offensive guard can put him in a box. If you get a guy that's athletic enough to hang with his quickness, he doesn't have too much of a plan B. He's got a couple of different ways he wins. He's got a variety of finesse moves, and for an undersized guy that his overall play strength is not great, he does have a good bull rush at times because of the get off and the speed, and he's able to get under guys' pads. And I'm not saying he can't win with power, but he should be a 2, and he is by far this team's 1. But at the same time, he's like the reason that they're still 18th to 24th in terms of pass rush. I'm not saying they suck; they just aren't amazing, and Ed Oliver is the biggest part of that. And then beyond Oliver, it's super average, man. Like Greg Rousseau, I loved Greg Rousseau coming out. I think he's turned into a good player and, is better. A lot of people thought he was just going to be a bust. I thought he was going to be probably a little better than he's been so far. It's been kind of in the middle because he was a total my guy in that draft. But, he's a very one-dimensional rusher, and he himself has been a little bit matchup dependent where, if he goes against a tackle with shorter arms, it's not the strongest dude. Like his length, his strength, his energy is very potent. And he even had some games that he took over last year. But for every one of those games, there's probably 2 that he just kind of disappears in, at least as a rusher. Doesn't really have those counter moves. Doesn't have a lot of bend around the corner. He's not the quickest guy. He's just a long, strong, high energy, kind of 2B type of edge rusher who is also elevated a little bit by being one of the better run defending edge rushers in the league. You got to give him credit there. That is where the floor is set with him. He's kind of like what people thought Trayvon Walker was supposed to be, where it's like, all right, well, he's got a lot to learn as a pass rusher, and you hope those things come along, and they have for Greg Rousseau over the years. But at least like His traits have made him a dominant run defender in the league. Hasn't really been the case with a Trayvon Walker. At least that's been the case with Greg Rousseau. So with him being your number 2, it's like, okay, you could do worse, but you've got, a guy like Oliver who's probably a 2A is made to be your 1. A guy that's probably a 2B is made to be your 2. And it's just like, you're typecasting these guys into a role that's not ideal. And that's where Von Miller comes in. And I know we're not listing Von Miller as one of the 4 starters here, but he is probably the biggest overall wild card for this Bills team, but it's not a wild card I'm betting on. I said it the second he got injured, this is his second significant career knee injury at 35 years old. I don't care that he's one of the freakiest athletes to ever play football in the NFL. At a certain point, it just might be time. And I tried to warn Bills fans of this last year, where I know we've been on this run of like miraculous ACL recoveries, but this is a little bit different. And I was really worried that he just wasn't going to be a factor for the Bills. And that's exactly what happened. He didn't get back till week 5. He was on a huge rotation all year long. But it wasn't just the playing time. It's the fact that he just wasn't good. Didn't register a single sack, under a 10% pressure rate, which is like what we've talked about is like the cutoff for like a starting caliber player in the NFL. Like if you're under 10%, like you probably shouldn't be on the field much. And that's where Von Miller was. Now he probably had his 2 best games in the playoffs. He had 2 pressures on 15 snaps against Kansas City, and that was his most efficient outing. But that's just not much of an impact, right? Now, I'm not entirely saying he's just useless either. That's why the yellow arrow is there. And that's why he still grades out in the green for me, which is way better than he played last year for this team as a 77 grade here, as still like a useful impact player. And there is a world where, all right, he started to show a little bit more life, in the playoffs last year, and maybe a full offseason to fully recover, and he can get a little bit closer to, 2022 Von Miller, where he was playing at a really high level before the knee injury. And he's not going to be a full-time starter. They're smarter than that. But if he can get some of his explosiveness back, stay healthy in a role where he's only playing 15 snaps, you could put him in high leverage situations throughout the course of the season, save him for the playoffs, and still get a difference-making edge rusher that they really need. And if you get that sort of best-case scenario out of Von Miller, you are talking about probably closer to a top half of the league pass rush, at least when they need it, right? In terms of total pressures, the entire season, overall impact, maybe not, but when it's January 12th and you need guys to get after the quarterback, this could be an above average group if Von Miller can recover and be that guy. And I think every Bills fan is realistic about this situation and just hoping that he can get back some of his juice. I'm not saying that's going to happen, though, because he was very flat with plenty of time to recover last year, and he's going to be 36 when the season's over. It just might be time. And man, that injury could not have come at a worse time for the Bills when that was like the move that they thought was going to set this team over the edge. It looked like it was going to be for a little bit, and then just snap of a finger, man. Injuries suck, but you also got to be realistic about it. So that said, with him not starting, that means AJ Epinesa is the starting edge here. Very much fine. He has his moments. He's got a good finesse tool belt. It's just he doesn't have athleticism. So in terms of generating a bull rush, converting speed to power, or winning with bend around the edge, or winning with a lightning quick, first step and fast feet, it's just he's going against better athletes pretty much every snap, and that reduces his overall efficiency. But he has some weeks where he can have some pretty wins. Got to give him credit for the amount of swats that he had last year. He's smart in that, okay, if I'm not going to win every rep, if I'm going to get stonewalled, I better at least use my length and look for swats. And he can contribute that way. He's an okay run defender. He's a fine player, got paid as much. It's about all we got to say on AJ Epinesa. Bringing him back was a necessity because they needed somebody else, knowing Von Miller wasn't going to be able to play that much. And then your last starter here is another injury concern, another age concern in Daquan Jones. When healthy, Daquan has been one of the more underrated players in the league in his time in Buffalo. Kind of out of nowhere, you went from a guy that was like kind of an average starting all-around defensive tackle for like 6 or 7 years with the Titans. But in his time in Buffalo, he's been like an above-average pass rusher, like well above average, and a really good run defender. And their defensive line, it's night and day when he's out there. But we're right back to this conversation. He's going to be 33 years old, working against Father Time, and only gave them 20% of snaps last year. But also, like, his impact against the run and his ability to actually two-gap a little bit and be more of a bigger bodied in the middle is a big deal when you have Ed Oliver who can't do that, right? They did sign Austin Johnson to be a little bit of that guy. He's kind of their Tim Settle, Linval Joseph replacement. He's a big body, but not nearly as good at, making plays as a run defender than a guy like Daquan. Decent enough signing as depth, but it's a fall off for sure from Daquan. And then, Dwayne Carter is an Ed Oliver backup. He's undersized. He's a, finesse rushing specialist for an interior defensive lineman. I actually wasn't that big on this draft pick in the 3rd round. I don't know. I'd love to be wrong. He's a fun player, and when he connects on a spin move and some of his pass rush moves, it's pretty, but the efficiency fell off in his final year, and I just don't look at him as a guy that's going to be ever a starting caliber guy in the NFL, and it's not like he's so efficient as a pass rusher that he's like a designated 3rd down superstar pass rusher. Doesn't have the size to defend the run. I see him as just a true Ed Oliver backup, where if Oliver's injured for a week, you can get 65% of that role from Dwayne Carter. I don't know. Maybe that's being overly pessimistic, and we'll see where it goes. But I didn't love that draft pick. Deshaun Williams, he's a tweener type. He's eating up some snaps. He's fine. Two-way player, but nothing special. Eli Onko, another big run defender that's, hasn't played a lot, but he's been okay when he's played, according to the PFF grades. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I've pounded Eli Onko tape, but it's kind of the profile he comes in under, but not really exciting depth, in my opinion, from the interior D-line. And then the edge depth, we still got to talk about after Von Miller. Dwayne Smoot, nice enough signing. Had a really bad year last year. Jacksonville ended up letting him go. He's had a hard time, I think, recovering from an injury himself. But prior to the injury, he's been a good number 3 for Jacksonville as a pass rusher. Really high energy, strong guy. A nice enough signing for what he is, just as an emergency plan. Give you a little bit more pass rushing help if Von Miller can't stay healthy. And then Javon Solomon's interesting. 5th round pick, undersized guy, great get off, great bend. I do think as a, flex piece in certain blitz looks in his rookie season, he might get you 10 to 12 pressures on like 35 snaps, be an efficient kind of specific weapon for blitz looks because he's got the speed and the bend and you can weaponize him that way. I don't know how much like true starting time he's going to get and ability he's going to have to win one-on-one reps, at least for now. A nice enough pick as a 5th rounder, but a long way to go before he's an impact player. And then, Casey Toohill, Kingsley Jonathan, not counting on those guys to give you much. It's a fine but unexciting defensive line that is a little hard to predict given the age of some of their impact players. There's some upside here if you can get a lot from Daquan Jones and Von Miller to exceed my overall rankings on them. But there's honestly downside for this to go in the wrong direction too. And I honestly don't know which way I would bet on either. So it's tough. Now you're feeling much better about the linebackers here. They rank out really well here. 7th to 8th for overall linebacker. 4th to 7th for linebacker coverage. And then solid for run defense as well, 12th to 20th. And here as well, you have Matt Milano coming back from the injury. He seems to be much more dependable compared to like Jones and Von Miller. 29 years old, seems like he's killing it at camp and definitely doesn't have a long record of injuries or anything. So feel pretty good that you're getting the old Matt Milano back. And man, he's been in his prime the last couple of years. I feel really good about him here. He's maybe the smartest overall coverage player in the league in terms of when to take risks, when not to take risks. That's a key distinction. But also just kind of having that natural ability to flow into traffic, to understand route combinations, where the quarterbacks are trying to go with the ball without having to look around and do too much. He's just understands how to cover. He's not the biggest guy. He's not the fastest guy, but consistently getting his hands on footballs, whether that's interceptions or pass breakups. Getting him back is a big deal. And he's a really good run defender too. The one reason he's a green-coated good starter for me as a run defender and not higher than that as more of a star run defender is he from a physical presence, getting off blocks, he's fine at it. I would say above average, but nothing special. And then he does miss more tackles than you would like to see from a superstar linebacker. That's probably the gap from him up to the next tier of superstar linebackers. But a top 10 linebacker nonetheless. Getting him back will certainly secure things in the middle of the defense a little bit. But even then, it's like he was one of the guys that went down, and Tyrel Dodson actually stepped up and played out of his mind last year. But you probably weren't counting on that again, and you're damn happy that Milano's going to be able to come back and be Matt Milano. But next to him, you got Terrell Bernard, who's been a pleasant surprise for me. I didn't see it when they drafted him, but was definitely one of those guys where I was like, all right, well, if Buffalo likes this guy, I'm probably just wrong. And that's exactly what's happened. They've done such a good job with these linebackers. It's funny that the only linebacker that couldn't really develop here was Tremaine Edmonds. But yeah, Terrell Bernard isn't the biggest guy, isn't the fastest guy, kind of like Matt Milano, but plays with his hair on fire, loves to play the position, clearly, and clearly has the work ethic to get on the grind, to learn his read keys, understand his coverage assignments. Coverage is the aspect where teams have been able to pick on him a little bit more. But heading into year 3 now, I think the arrow is absolutely pointing up. I think he could be something like a Matt Milano long term. He just seems like a really smart, balanced player, is exactly their type. And just like Matt Milano, Terrell Bernard has serious tackling issues holding him back. Mentioned Matt Milano would be a tier higher if he was a more consistent tackler. Same thing with Terrell Bernard. I still view him as more of a, kind of an average to above average starter, but would rank him as a good starter if he wasn't 76th in the NFL out of 88 players in missed tackle percentage. And that is going to happen when you just don't have the physical tools as a lot of the guys you're trying to tackle, but you got to get that down. Otherwise, a lot of your good plays are going to be negated by missed tackles and just overall inconsistencies. So that's the biggest thing to look for him, and just general growth in terms of coverage understanding, which is tough for these young linebackers. But I think that can definitely continue to grow for him, and he can become, a really good player for the Bills in time. But it doesn't stop there. I love Dorian Williams, and honestly, in limited looks, he only played 200 snaps, but when he was out there, he looked like the frickin' man for the Bills. His speed, his ability to hit, the range he has in coverage, he's not as big, but he's much closer to giving the Bills kind of what they were going for when they had Edmonds and Milano, with the freak and the smart dude. Not saying Dorian Williams isn't smart, but I think if you're projecting this linebacker room out maybe 3 years and saying, all right, Bernard's the captain of the defense, the more consistent overall player, and Dorian Williams is our playmaker, the guy that can man up running backs and tight ends, make more of those impact plays, I could totally see it. Big fan of his game, was a big fan of him as a draft pick, showed all the signs you could ever hope for when he was out there in his rookie year. And he's a good backup to have. If either of these guys go down, I think you can actually be a little excited about him getting on the football field and not missing too much of a beat. Yet again, though, with Dorian Williams, missed tackle percentage was way down there with like Terrell Bernard. These guys got to hit the tackle dummies this year. Again and again and again. Then you go down the board, and it's like these guys love their archetype scouting. You have Balin Spector, who's in the Bernard archetype, just not as good. Smart dude that lacks traits. And then you got Edefwan Ulofoshio. Again, not saying he's a dumb guy, but much more wins off his athleticism than he does off of his overall IQ at the position. He's kind of another Dorian Williams type, but not as good. Both guys drafted later for that reason. A lot of guys to just kind of develop here in general. And then they did sign some veterans to kind of give them opportunities to compete for spots in camp. Nicholas Morrow, who's started a lot of games over the last couple of years and been very hit or miss. And Deion Jones is still hanging around. He actually played okay for the Panthers last year in coverage, but God, I mean, clearly they don't mind missed tackles because they signed Deion Jones, and no one else here can tackle all that well. Quite clearly, tackling is not very high on the pecking order in this room in terms of who they want to sign and draft and all that. But very good linebacker room. I would even say a difference-making linebacker room. One of the better groups in terms of like not committing on play action, not taking the cheese, not getting just constantly peppered by RPOs and that kind of stuff. In a league where the majority of linebacker rooms are getting attacked week in, week out, you got to kind of find other spots on this Bills team to pick on. Not that they won't give that stuff up, but it's certainly not as bad as most of the teams in the league. And maybe as we transition to the secondary, this is going to be the group that you look to pick on a little bit more. And this is not a bad secondary, but it's certainly not the most explosive, shutdown, dominant secondary either. Yet again, we have a position group with a C+ grade. And that's good for 19th to 23rd. So, like, they're all right. There's a lot of worse secondaries in the league, but it's hard for me to get that excited about the Bills secondary as well. So you got Rasul Douglas is probably their best outside corner currently. Really nice addition. I love Rasul Douglas. He's a total playmaker within this system. Some of the best zone IQ in the NFL. It made so much sense when they targeted him. From Green Bay, going from Joe Barry's quarters-heavy system. They love quarters. They love an opportunity for Rasul Douglas to be kind of an extension of the safety staff where he's playing 10 yards off, can read the quarterback's eyes, trigger downfield, use his ball skills and his length to make plays. Gives you essentially no man-to-man flexibility at all, which is fine. The Bills don't run a lot of man-to-man, so within the system, he makes total sense, but there's limitations to him as well. And honestly, I might as well digress for a second and just point out, like, one of my frustrations with McDermott is, like, this is how he wants to build his secondary. He wants to play that top-down, soft, squishy kind of quarters-style defense, that bend-don't-break style. He's a little more multiple than some of these failed defensive coordinators like a Joe Barry. Like, from a schematic point of view, he'll blitz at the right time, play man, play press in more appropriate situations. But with how the roster's constructed, they don't always have the guys to do that. And that is where you talk about some of the lack of upside with this Bills defense, is some of the adaptability. They're going to do what they do. They're going to do it damn well. But you get to go into the game knowing how they're going to play you and knowing that they can't really pivot off of that. And Rasul Douglas being their best corner is a part of that. Nice player, though. Opposite of him, you've got Christian Benford. Who, it feels like the first year where it's like, head into the year, it's Christian Benford's job. He came in as a 7th-round pick with first-rounder Kyer Elam, and he's completely fended him off. A lot of length, solid athlete, really smart, physical, tough player. Still kind of proving what his upside is. Has never been a full-time starter. He's a good but not sensational athlete. But when he was on the field last year, he was their best outside corner from a just down-to-down coverage perspective. And Probably their best man-to-man guy as well, which is good for him, but also like, all right, you got to cover Garrett Wilson, Tyreek Hill, and if you want to go man coverage, it's like, all right, Christian, you got it. It's like, it's not great. I don't know, Jim. That's where we're at with Christian Benford. I like him. I still think the arrow is pointing up on him. Bills fans are going to tell me, I'm too low on him and all that, but I'm not going to sit here and act like I'm like glowing with enthusiasm with the idea that he might be your best corner this year. And then Teron Johnson, great player, but he's a slot corner. Very, very similar to everything we talked about with Kenny Moore for the Colts. Him and Kenny, I think, are the two highest IQ zone corners, slot corners in the NFL. They make plays, they jump routes, enough athletic ability to kind of hang at receivers' breaking points. Not the most physically dominant players, but like good overall run defenders. I think Kenny's got a little bit of a nod over Teron, but not by much in terms of run defense. But I think Teron's a little bit better as a complete coverage player as well. So you love having him, but he's a slot corner. Necessary for the defense, for sure. Gives you good short to intermediate coverage, but in terms of the flexibility and handling, the game's elite wide receivers, again, you just don't really have that guy here right now. You go down the board. I mean, Kyer Elam, I don't think you can completely give up on Kyer Elam. It's been a crowded room in terms of opportunities. He's been injured, but some of his issues at Florida have shown up. The grabbiness, the lack of zone IQ was always interesting when they got him. And that's why it was such a bummer that the Chiefs jumped them for McDuffie. Because it's like, God, McDuffie's so freaking smart. He would have been so perfect in this defense. Just outclassed in every way by the Chiefs, recognizing that talent and having to jump the Bills to get him. Because who knows if things might have changed if it was McDuffie on the Bills. And I bet the Chiefs would have liked Elam. He's kind of their type. Very easily could have changed hands there. Don't mean to bag on Bills fans about that, though. I know it's a sore subject. But I still think Elam has a chance to emerge as a guy. He has good individual reps. His man-to-man ability is still there. I think he could be, to use another Chief parallel, something like a Shavarius Ward. Now, he's got to stay healthy and become a smarter overall zone player before he gets those starting opportunities. But if you look down the road a little bit, and it's like, okay, Rasul's probably not going to be here for the long haul. I think that he's just got 1 year left. If you do want a guy that can be more of a in-your-face press corner, give you a little bit more flexibility, I still think Elam could get there. I don't know. I'm not saying I'd bet on it, but I don't know if, I'm not entirely betting against it either. I just think potential is still in there with him. But it does fall off after him. I mean, Cam Lewis has been kind of like a backup hybrid slot safety type of dude. He's probably your immediate Teron Johnson backup. But they did draft Daquan Hardy, slot type, 5'9", 180 pounds. I liked his tape. That was a very small draft win for me. There was 3 Penn State corners, and nobody talked about Daquan Hardy at all, but I did have him ranked higher than the other 2 guys, and he ended up getting drafted higher. Didn't have the length of the other guys, didn't have the outside profile, but smart, scrappy, athletic slot corner. I like him. We'll see what he can be. Jamarcus Ingram has gotten some snaps for this team as well, but that rounds out, pretty, normal, standard corner depth. And you might say that sounds like a pretty good cornerback room, better than, 19th to 23rd in terms of overall secondary grade. Maybe not a lot better, but maybe a little bit better. But it is the safety room that knocks them down a little bit, especially within a scheme. They run a lot of quarters and cover 6 with quarters principles. And you could argue when you're calling quarters, the safety group is maybe as important, if not more important, as the cornerbacks. In fact, I would argue they are a good bit more important, and it's a reason, they haven't had the most stable group of corners here, but the secondary still played really well, having Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer on the back end. And the combination of those guys is communication, understanding of their role, the leadership on the back end, the ability to come down and contribute in run support, and their playmaking on the back end within this defense is going to be missed, and they are going to have to shuffle through some things to figure out how they can get back to what they had, or at least something close to what they had. And that starts with the Cole Bishop pick, who made just the absolute utmost amount of sense. I'll talk about him a little bit, but literally all I have to say is written in my draft analysis before the draft, the pro comp on Cole Bishop was Micah Hyde. Like, he is the perfect skill set to hopefully get one of those guys back. And the reason the comp is there is not just from a physical standpoint, where he's a little bit slender, built a little bit more like a corner, maybe not the most dominant run defender, and Bishop needs to improve his tackling to get where Micah Hyde's consistency was. That is one starting point that needs to improve from Cole Bishop. But in terms of being a very fluid slot corner in college that played a ton of zone defense, but will be more of a split safety, hybrid, cover 4 oriented safety at the next level, that's the exact thing that happened with Micah Hyde, and I think Cole Bishop's going to be really good. He's not going to be Micah Hyde right away. It takes a long time to get to Micah's level in terms of understanding those assignments, when it's the right time to trigger downfield and go be a playmaker, when you need to pass off a certain route combination, being a guy that has the confidence to communicate those things mid-play, pointing guys off, being that leader on the back end, that field general on the back end. There's a long way to go before he's that type of impact, but I see a very similar player. It's just a much more of a question of like when as opposed to more if on Cole Bishop. I'm not saying he's going to be quite as good as Micah Hyde, but it just makes total sense that he was their replacement there. You got probably even bigger questions opposite of Cole Bishop. Certainly guys that have played a lot more, but in terms of the overall upside, it just isn't there. And they probably will need more of a long-term answer here in the future. For now, they're just kind of going with the veteran hand approach. Currently, I'm seeing Taylor Rapp listed as the starter. He knows the defense. He has struggled in coverage on the Bills, but it's been in a different assignment. You go back to 2022, right, on the Rams. Could have been 2021, forgive me. But the last time he was a full-time starter for the Rams in that very similar defense, it was the Brandon Staley quarters-heavy defense. Same idea, playing a lot more true starting safety. He was pretty good in that role. He's just not a great athlete, but he's smart, understands the rules and all that. Probably not going to be a liability for you, but also not the biggest playmaker on the back end. And a guy that if you scheme it up right with a fast wide receiver, he just can't keep up. Like those quarters beaters where you're trying to, suck in the safety on one side with like a deep curl, and then you take your Hollywood Brown for the Chiefs or whoever that's, Christian Watson, whoever that explosive vertical guy is. If you get Taylor Rapp one-on-one and he's got to turn and burn on a deep post, he just doesn't have that range on the back end. So he's a guy you can get, even if he's got a high floor. Mike Edwards is kind of the opposite. Not that he's a super athlete, but he's a risk taker on the back end and not nearly the stable run defender in terms of tackling consistency and taking the right angles from the back end. That's why ultimately I don't think he starts. I think he's more of a dime back. They prefer to stay in nickel, but Mike Edwards has been kind of a distinguished role on the Bucs and the Chiefs where, all right, if we get into dime and we want someone to kind of lurk and try to be a playmaker, that's kind of what he is, not so much a starting option for them. You got DeMar Hamlin. What is this, year 4 in this system? Obviously a unique conversation in terms of like, is he good to go with the heart situation? But just strictly as a football player, not the most athletic overall player, but a smart dude, showed some flashes before that crazy situation. Very cool that he's in the mix, at least, for the starting job. Would be awesome to see him out there. And, I don't think he's got crazy upside or anything like that, but could he settle in as like an okay temporary starter for them as they look for more high upside down the road? Yeah, I could see it. And then they also signed Kareem Jackson for some extra insurance. Probably, honestly, their best option. Wouldn't be surprised if he ends up starting back there. He's like 36 years old at this point, but he as well has been in this style of system. played a lot for Vic Fangio's defenses, and has done a lot of quarters over the years. Did a lot of that stuff with D'Amico when he went to Houston at the end of the year last year. It's who he is. He's a converted corner turned safety that is good for these assignments, but an overall limited player and not the impact as a run defender that someone like Taylor Rapp would be coming downhill. So they've got a decision to make. I think they'll end up getting a high floor option, whether that's Rapp or Jackson or Hamlin taking a step up, kind of earning this job, but also not a difference maker on the back end. Got some flyers on guys like Delaney and Burgess as well, but it is going to be very different not seeing Micah and Poyer back there. And I do think they brought not just like good coverage themselves, but they brought a certain floor in terms of the communication, the lack of busts, the passing things off mid-play. When you run this type of defense, it's so important. And they're missing a lot there. To lose both those guys in one offseason, I really think is a big deal. And this is where Bills fans, I think, it might be the most mad at me as we wrap up this defense. I've got them ranked as the 22nd overall defense. And they've, exceeded that every year, basically in the kind of championship era of this Bills team. And they could do that again, right? I don't know that they'll be a great defense. They just don't have a lot of high-end talent. But they could certainly be the 14th best defense because they just are well-coached, have a good floor, and are stable. But I'm worried, man. From a talent perspective, nobody's afraid of that pass rush. We just talked about what you're missing in the secondary that you used to have. And your best group are linebackers. Like, okay, that's great, but can only make so much of an impact there. And I think this kind of sets it up where, okay, this might go one of two ways. This could go really south. McDermott's defense is bottom half in the league. The talent's just not there. If that happens, the Bills are kind of a fringe playoff team, a team that's going to have a hard time winning a playoff game, basically just Josh Allen and nothing else. And if that happens, it's like, all right, it's time to move on from McDermott. Or if this is the 11th best defense in the league and the Bills win 11 games and it's not just the offense doing all the work, I would be able to look back on this and be like, all right, he completely flipped the roster over inside out. Most of the leaders on this defense are gone. And McDermott took a below-average roster and turned it into a top-half defense in the league. Again, I just don't see high-end upside from this defense. I just don't. There's not a single player on this team that I say is a difference-making, numbers-changing superstar. They have some good players, Milano, Oliver, Teron Johnson. But if McDermott were to take this defense and even, go win a playoff game, make it tough against the Chiefs or whoever the top team was they had to play in round 2, I might cool off on the McDermott hate a little bit. But I'm not going to lie, man, with this 14th ranking and just to tease the schedule outlook that we're going to look at in just a minute, I'm kind of betting against that for the Bills this year. I'm sorry to say that, Bills fans. But we do got to talk special teams first. Not a ton to say here. They ranked out as my 22nd special teams using my formula. Above average punter and Sam Martin. He's pretty good. Tyler Bass, God, that was rough at the end of last year. And, if Tyler Bass can make his kicks, Bills maybe are talking about being a Super Bowl team last year. So, it's a polarizing football team to say the least. But yeah, he's got to kind of get out of his head a little bit. Otherwise, it's a good culture, good depth. They should be able to cover kicks and all that stuff. There's just not a ton to say about this special teams. Obviously hurt them last year. They're hoping that isn't the case this year. But then the last thing before we look at the schedule is to recap their strengths, weaknesses, and pivotal factors. And man, I had a hard time putting this list together. I don't think this team has a lot of strengths, honestly, other than Josh Allen. So I put down Josh Allen, hold my beer for the strengths on this team. And then, defensive coaching is a strength. I wish it was an elite strength, but it is a strength. And then weaknesses too. It's like, okay, we've had our criticisms here, but they don't have like crazy weaknesses. The safety room is a major question mark, but the secondary as a whole, I wouldn't say is a weakness. And even the receiving threats, like They're still overall okay in terms of weaponry. It's just they're missing a specific piece for their group of weapons, being more of an outside receiving threat, more of an explosive vertical option. So even their weaknesses, it's like, yeah, but they have other guys in that room that they can kind of work around. But then you look at the like pivotal factors for this team, and that's where it's really weird. Like, what are the spots on this Bills team where it's either like, okay, the floor could fall off and things could go horrible, or like, where's the upside? Where's like the things that it's like, okay, you got some questions here, but like maybe it could pop off and be amazing and elevate this group. There's just not much to say there. The Bills, I hate the saying, and I've been trying to not use it very much, but I think the Bills kind of are what they are in so many ways. The only wild card factor I have for them that could determine some of the success of this team is the health on the D-line. If Von Miller is more than we're projecting and Jones can stay healthy, like that's actually a pretty good defensive line that could make this defense a little bit better. Inversely, if those guys get hurt, you're in trouble. Other than that, though, it's like, I feel like this is a really high floor team that's like, all right, Josh, go get it. You know? Really weird team this year. But let's wrap this up by looking at their schedule, where I'm projecting them in terms of wins. And despite all the change, the market is not budging on the Buffalo Bills. I pushed back on the hype on them a little bit last year. They were Super Bowl favorites heading into last year. I ranked them 5th. I'd say that aged pretty well. So I was lower on the Bills last year. They ended up, getting eliminated in the divisional round. So I'd say we did pretty good last year. But then this year, it's like, man, we're still doing this with the Bills. Like, the market still loves this team. And I'm pushing back on it even further this year. I'm much more worried about this year's Bills team than I was last year's Bills team, especially looking at this schedule. So your division's tough. We know that. Other than Patriots, it's great you get to play them twice. But Dolphins and Jets 4 times, that's a lot. But then they drew the AFC South. We just did the Colts. They're a really interesting team. Texans are going to be tough. Jags are not an easy out. They gave a better Bills team an absolute run for their money in London last year. That's going to be a good game, week 3. Titans you should be able to handle. But then you got NFC West, so Niners, Rams, Cardinals week 1. That'll be a fun game. Should be a lot of offense in that game. Looking forward to that. But then at Seattle, too. I'd much rather get to host Seattle than have to go to play against the 12s out there. But then the big whammy is you got that first place schedule. So you end up having to go to Baltimore, host Kansas City, host San Francisco, and go to Detroit. Ouch. That's where the, evening the scales with the scheduling stuff, that could really come back to bite the Bills. It's not an easy schedule. There's winnable games in there for sure. You got Josh Allen. You're not going to be a huge underdog in any game. And the only game I have them as a big underdog is at Baltimore. So they're going to be in the mix every single week because they have Josh Allen. But with an over-under of 10.5, my formula has them a whole win below that, 9.3. I think their over-under should be 9.5, not 10.5. And this actually is a bet that I would make. I will be betting against the Bills over-under this year. And Bills fans, let's have some fun, man. I do like the Bills. I want this to work. Josh Allen's one of my favorite players in the league. I think McDermott's a good dude. I have great interaction with you Bills fans. I feel so bad for you because the Bills remind me so much of my Packers. Like, I've called them the AFC Packers because of the heartbreak where you have this great quarterback and you just can't get over the hump. I feel you. But this Bills team reminds me a lot of some of those Packers teams that it's like, man, this was not the best offseason. And our coach, kind of some Mike McCarthy vibes going on with Sean McDermott. So, again, Bills fans, I love you guys. I'm sorry to bet against you this year. Really hope I'm wrong. Hope you guys can come back, throw egg in my face, and Josh Allen can dunk on Pat Mahomes in the AFC Championship. But certainly not betting on it. Let me know what you guys think of the ranking, non-Bills fans. Where are you at with this? You agree with me? Am I crazy? Let me know all of it down below. Who do you think comes next in the rankings with our 13th spot? Beyond that, just if you're still here and haven't hit that like button yet, I really appreciate it. Make sure you're subscribed, and we'll see you guys soon for the next deep dive. Thanks for watching. Peace out.